This is the second of our 3 online CPD sessions for those senior ambassadors and some junior ambassadors as well, who weren't able to join us at Europe House. So we're going to be joined today by Typhaine and Sanna, who both work for the European Parliamentary Liaison Office in the UK. Typhaine is Public Relations and Press Officer, and Sanna is the Parliamentary Liaison. They're both experts in the way the Parliament runs and the way in which it interacts with the UK public and the UK government. So obviously, today's a day when we've had all kinds of interesting news about elections and momentous things happening, but it's been a momentous year in many ways. And so we're going to hear a bit more from Typhaine and Sanna about how the elections in the UK and the elections in across the European Union, European parliamentary elections, are affecting those UK relations, UK and EU relations. So over the course of the session, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. That way we'll try and stop any crosstalk. And also for the recording, it's really useful because the chat doesn't always show up in the recording. So I will ask those questions out loud to Sanna and Typhaine towards the end of the session. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. And now I'm going to hand over to Typhaine to take you through where we are at the moment.
Thank you very much. So I'll do a very short presentation about the European Parliament, what's its role within the EU institution, how it works, and what it looks like now after the European elections back in June. And then we'll take questions at the end, as Asha said. But if there's anything throughout my presentation, which lasts about 10 minutes, which is not clear, Asha, feel free to interrupt and ask me questions along the way if there's anything that is not clear. So some of you might have attended some of these presentations. I want to bore you with boring institutional things, but as you can see in this image, it's not always very easy to remember who is who and who does what within the EU institution, but in Europe as well. You can see here the Conseil de l'Europe, the Human Rights Court, which are not part of the EU. So we thought maybe a short refresher on who does what would be helpful. First, the EU itself. So that's just to put things in perspective. This is where we are now, 27 member states now, as you know, back from 28 member states before Brexit. That's the EU as it stands now. How does it work? So it's not that complicated, as I like to say. It's very similar to any federal system, I would say. So these are the main institutions of the EU, with the European Parliament, the European Commission, playing the role of the government for the EU, the European Parliament being obviously the parliamentary chamber, and the European Council/Council of the European Union being the interest of the member states. I'll go back to that in a couple of minutes about who does what exactly in terms of adopting the legislation. What is key to keep in mind, though, I just made a reference to a federal state. The EU is not a state. It does not function as such. It's made of autonomous member states who retain a big chunk of the decision-making in lots of areas. So this is how it works. Exclusive means the issues on which the EU has the sole competence and that can make decisions for the whole of the European Union. So that's mostly on trade, on customs, because of the internal market, on competition, and on some obviously on the euro as well. Most of the legislation now adopted in the EU is shared, which means that both the European Parliament and the governments have to agree on it for it to be effective. So you have the list here of some of the topics that are what we say co-decided by the EU and the European Parliament. which again also means that apart from these exclusive topics, there's no legislation which is adopted in the EU where the governments do not have their say. Now, what we call supporting legislation is the top topics where the European Parliament and the EU can be consulted, can make proposals. Education, for instance, Erasmus is a good example. That's a European policy, but that's because all the member states agreed to work together on that. So all these issues, education and social security, health, culture, but also taxes, for instance, are still very much decided by the EU member states themselves. So how does it work on all these issues where there's a shared competence between, oops, sorry, I've been too fast, between the governments, the member states, and the European Parliament? So I just referred to the European Commission as being the equivalent of the government for the EU. That's very much what they do. So you might have heard that these weeks the commissioners are being heard by the European Parliament. That's very much a job interview, and they're going to be then appointed, if all these interviews go well, in a few weeks. So once a commissioner has been appointed, he is in charge of a portfolio. So that's very much like a minister. They're in charge of agriculture, education, trade, and so on and so forth. So they are responsible for proposing the legislation on these issues. Once the legislation has been proposed by the European Commission, then it's for the Parliament and for the Council of the EU to make the decision. So they receive the same legislation. They both have to make amendments. And what is interesting there is that, again, they represent very different interests. So the European Parliament represents the citizens' voice. The elections just took place. When you go to the ballot box, what matters is the political parties that you're voting for. So that's very much a political institution, and that's along these lines that the legislation is being discussed. Obviously, the governments are there to represent their interests, be they economic, cultural, social. So the same text can lead to very different discussions in each institution. One of the examples I like to give, which I think is pretty straightforward, is legislation on car emissions, for instance. When it goes to Parliament, you will have a clear split between the political parties who say that the top priority is to fight climate change, so that these legislation need to be very, very strict and need to very strong environmental standards, whereas some other political groups will say that it's the economy that matters most, keeping jobs in Europe, and don't want to put Europe at a disadvantage compared to China, the US, etc. So that's sort of the lines there. When it goes to the Council of the European Union, then the minister will have a very different position depending on whether they have a car industry in their country and factories and workers, or if they don't. So obviously, if they have a strong car industry, they're more likely to try and get amendments to lower the standards so that it doesn't impact their industries and factories too much. If they don't, well, obviously they will be more keen to have probably a much more pro-environmental legislation. So that's what is at stake every time we have a legislative discussion. Now, the European Parliament itself, what is it made of and how does it work? This is just to remind you of the overall numbers. So we have 720 members of the European Parliament now. As you can see, how many members each country gets is very much based on the population. Obviously, we have such huge difference between the smallest member states and the biggest one that you need to find a balance. There are caps on the minimum number and on the maximum number that a country can have, which sort of favors the smallest countries, obviously. What matters, though, when MEPs are elected is not where they come from, their country of origin. It's very much what party they represent, what they've been elected for. So this image is very much the basis of everything that goes on in Parliament and how things are organized. The first thing you can see here, which explains a lot about the way the European Parliament functions, is that it's very different from a majority system or a bipartisan system as here or as we used to have in France, for instance. So as you can see, no single, we call them political groups because they're made of lots of different parties, no single political group has a majority here. So even the EPP, which is the Christian Democrats, with 188 members, cannot do anything on its own. So you constantly have to build coalitions in order to get anything adopted. And again, I referred to the Commission as a government earlier. There's a big difference, though. The commissioners are appointed by their member states, which means that they cover a range of political affiliations. So we don't have a political color to the Commission. So you don't have a systematic majority or opposition system in the European Parliament. So even though you see the blue colors for the right-wing party, it doesn't mean that they naturally tend to vote together and create a majority. So the majorities very much change depending on the topics. Getting back to the European elections, again, you can see a lot of blue here. There were lots of talks before the elections that there will be a big surge of the far right, and that it might change the way Parliament functions a lot. There has been a shift, as you can see now. We have two far right groups, Patriots for Europe's Liaison, that are to the right of the ECR, which already has some pretty strong right components in it, but the center hasn't changed that much, hasn't shifted. So if you take the EPP, Renew Europe, which would be basically the Lib Dems, the Greens and S&Ds, which are the Labour Social Democrats Party, you still have a very strong centre in Parliament. So the equilibrium has not changed much, but we can see now in the debates, for instance, Parliament, with political leaders taking part in debates, that the tonality is shifting to probably something a bit less consensual. What does Parliament look like in terms of the people in it, the MEPs? So 720 coming from 200 national political parties. So that gives you an idea of how it takes a bit of time for MEPs to get used to how it works, because they all come from different countries, different cultures, and different ways of doing politics. Also, half of them are new to Parliament. That's sort of the standard thing. Every election, half of the members will be re-elected, but half are completely new to Parliament. So we used to say that it takes about a year for a new Parliament to be fully functioning, to really have this grasp of how things are done. You can see that we have some young MEPs. 23 is the youngest one. We've had some young MEPs elected in different countries. I think 23 is a young influencer from Bulgaria. To check that, but I think that's what it is. And 76 for the oldest. So 50 is the average age of the MEPs. It hasn't changed much over the last elections. What has changed, though, and not for the better, is that the proportion of women is slightly lower than it was in the previous Parliament. It was 44%. It's only 39% now, with 61% men. There is a principle of gender balance during the European elections, but on the list. So that means that on the electoral list, you have to have the same number of men and women, but it doesn't say how they have to be split. So you can have lists where you would have more men first, and that's probably what happened to have this number here. Just a reminder of an additional complexity, but interest in the way we function. Because the members are elected because of their political engagement, they don't have to speak several languages. There's no degree that they need to have. So they need to be able to work exactly the same way, no matter their background and their education. So Parliament really functions in 24 official languages. It was thought to be completely impossible, especially after the last enlargement when 10 new countries joined. But it's actually a very smooth process that you can see if you watch the plenary session. So there's interpretation during plenaries in most of the committee meetings. And all the legislation is translated into 24 languages so that you can work on amendments with a text that you completely understand and not in a foreign language. Parliamentary committees, you can see the list here. We have now 20 standing committees and 4 subcommittees. What is important to keep in mind is that they're very, very different from committees in the House of Commons. So committees in the European Parliament are discussing legislation. So MEPs get the legislation from the European Commission, and most of their work is really to go into details on all of the text table amendments and agree on text which can be extremely technical. So that's very, very different from the way it functions here. The reason why there are so many committees is that there's a lot of legislation to cover. It means that MEPs, because they have to choose one committee as a full member and one as a substitute member, get very, very specialized throughout their 5 years as members. So they become expert in agriculture if they're in the agricultural committee, but they can't possibly follow everything which is going on in employment and social affairs, internal markets, and other aspects. Which leads me to that, which really shows you how the work is organized in the European Parliament. You can see there, well, 2024 is a bit of a special year because of the European election. So it would be different in 2025, where apart from the month of August, all the other months have a very similar structure. So half the time is spent on committee meetings. This is where it's really the nitty-gritty of the legislation, and this is what members spend most of their time working on. Now, because committees are a smaller version of the European Parliament, the biggest one is about 80 members, but it's still a small proportion of Parliament. Even if a text is approved by the committee, it needs to be then approved by the whole of the plenary. So that's what happens during the red weeks, the plenary sessions. That takes place once a month in Strasbourg. So what happens in between the moment where legislation is discussed really in detail in committees and the vote of the 720 MPs is a week for political groups where they go through the whole agenda and they make sure that they always have one member of their group following each topic in each legislation. So they will go through the agenda, they will report on the discussions in the committee, how the MEPs of a political group have positioned themselves, and then they agree on the position that they will have as a group during the votes in the plenary session. So when you reach the plenary session, you have the final debates on the vote, but the groups have already decided and explained how they were going to vote on each of the topic, which explains why that's always surprising for people who watch it. Most votes take place by show of hand. We do have electronic votes. That's 1/3 of the vote to keep record and for some votes to know exactly who voted why. But just for the sake of not wasting time, the quickest way to do it is to vote by show of hands. So that's how most of the decisions are taken. If any MEP, just one, raises their hand and asks for a check, then there's an electronic vote. So just to make sure that there's no contestation at all. That is it for me. I hope that was not too much information in one go. I just wanted to show you that the digital journey to the European Parliament. You can go to this website and there's a lot of interactive products to have all of that in more digestible format, and it's really interesting, and it's also good for students, for instance. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Typhaine. And yes, so there's lots of resources available for you from the European Parliament to work with your students to explain all of that in more detail. Some of that stuff was covered, some of those resources rather were mentioned by Anna yesterday. All the links are up on our website. So I'm going to hand over to Sanna now, who's going to talk a bit about this potential reset that has been discussed by the UK government. What does that mean, and what's the Parliament's position on that, and what does that mean from both perspectives?
Thanks, Asher, and thanks, Typhaine. Always a good refresher for me as well. Here and greetings everybody from Finland. I'm teleworking here this week, so I'm 2 hours ahead of you. I'm in the future already. So to talk a little bit about EU-UK relations, I'll also do a kind of a nutshell summary, and then very happy to look forward to your possible questions on the issue. Just a mini quick summary in the beginning. You could see there on Typhaine's map that indeed the UK joined the European Union in 1973. And of course, 2016 was the Brexit vote, and that was followed by several years of very, very difficult negotiations on how to rearrange the relations. And Brexit finally happened then in 2020, so 4 years ago. And now the relationship is kind of legally guided by two main agreements. One is called the withdrawal agreement, which is kind of the divorce settlement, as it's often called, which includes the Windsor Framework, which was previously called the Northern Ireland Protocol, that has all the guidelines how trade between the EU and Northern Ireland, and in part between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, happens as Northern Ireland stayed in the single market of the European Union while the rest of the UK left. The other main treaty that is again kind of guiding the relations is the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which is, as its name says, mostly on trade issues, something that also needs to be reviewed every 5 years. And the first review is coming up in 2026. And there are a lot of expectations, I think especially on the UK side in this review, that perhaps some things could be changed in this, to be seen. But so after these years of tension in the negotiations and so on, things are a lot better now already. And things actually started improving already during the previous government, since this Windsor Framework, again, the agreement that deals with the relations with Northern Ireland, was negotiated between Rishi Sunak's government and the European Commission and finalized in February last year. And that clearly already, many people are always saying that the mood music got better, and that you could see there started being more exchanges and a lot of the kind of the I don't know, is it also an English expression, but the kind of the little stones in the shoes were taken out. A lot of legislation that had been put in by the previous or introduced by the previous government was withdrawn, and some legislation that would have been very, very problematic for the EU. So things started getting better already last year. And it's no secret that when Labour Party was campaigning for the general election this year, they made it very clear that they want this reset with the EU. In the Labour manifesto, there are certain things that are listed there of things they want from EU relations. But in general, the party made it very clear that they want a closer relationship with the EU. So here we are, we're a few months now forward from the general election and Labour's win. And there are a lot of questions around the reset. Now it has become kind of the buzzword. What does the reset actually mean? And perhaps a big part of that is still an open question. It's quite clear that it has taken time on both sides of the channel to kind of re-establish all these institutions. UK elections in July, EU elections in June. Everybody has had to set up new committees, new institutions, the new government, and so on. So it's natural that it takes some time. kind of the sort of the positive things that Labour was saying about EU relations already in the beginning have materialized in the sense that right from the start, when the new government was established, Labour ministers started very actively traveling to Europe, meeting their counterparts there, discussing a lot of important issues. And one thing has been a clear sort of a positive, and again, kind of started with the previous government already, cooperation on security and defense issues, for example. And of course, because of Ukraine, the UK has been extremely active in its support for Ukraine, and so has the EU. So we've already been doing a lot of cooperation on things like sanctions, for example, and of course, both the monetary humanitarian aid to Ukraine, and including also military aid. And these are areas where it's kind of easy to go forward and deepen and widen the cooperation. So there's a lot of talk about a security pact that the EU and UK on both sides would really like to have. Actually, in the original negotiations after the Brexit referendum, a sort of a security pact or cooperation in security and foreign affairs was included in one of the chapters, but the UK government at that time then in the end decided to pull this out of the negotiations. So an agreement of cooperation, a formal agreement, was never done, and this could be now, well, something that could happen as both sides wanted. What the content of it is, again, is an open question, but it could be a rather broad agreement, also not including just kind of traditional security issues. Let's say people often think of just defense issues, but it could go into areas such as cybersecurity or energy or climate change cooperation, etc. Just a few more issues maybe before we go into the questions. One big meeting, of course, that happened already was between Prime Minister Keir Starmer and the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, in September or beginning of October, and there they agreed that the EU and UK will start having regular summits, which is a great thing, because it's not just, you know, we see the summits, the leaders go shake hands, they sit for a few hours somewhere and come out, but the preparations of these summits, those are the actual concrete points when the negotiations on all of these different issues will start happening on all levels in different working groups and different ministries and so on. So the summit is, of course, always kind of the tip of the iceberg that happens, but I'm quite sure that we will start seeing concrete progress once they start taking place. They haven't agreed a date yet for the first EU-UK summit, but beginning of 2025 is what is talked about. Maybe as the last thing, just to say that what might be some of the issues on both sides that are kind of on the table. In the Labour manifesto, the party has made it quite clear they want especially three things. One is a new veterinary agreement, kind of on trade of agri-food products to make it easier for companies to do that. Another thing is mutual recognition of professional qualifications, which is constantly causing, as it is missing, it's causing a lot of problems for people who would like to work on either side of or both sides of the channel. Let's put it that way. And the third thing is touring artists, UK artists who are currently facing extreme problems in trying to get their equipment, their merchandise, and tours actually in the EU area because of the new trade border that was built due to Brexit. On the EU side, there's maybe three things as well. I'll start with the one that may not be as interesting as the others, which is fishing waters in the UK. That's a deal that has to be renegotiated by 2026, and EU has a high interest in keeping the current system. And then the two others, maybe more in your field, the EU would very, very much welcome the UK back into the Erasmus Plus program, and also the EU would like to have a youth mobility scheme for people under 30, which would be a limited time visa-based scheme, but would allow youth from both sides to work and study easier than what it is currently possible. So in a nutshell, the relations are friendly and open, a lot of discussions going, but we are waiting for a lot of concrete results, perhaps in the next few years. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Sanna. So one thing I wanted, you were talking about sort of concrete results, and you were talking about the potential summits. Now, I know that last week you organised for various meetings between lots of MEPs coming from the EU to the UK. I'm sure you can't go into any detail of what was discussed, but what were the sort of topics that they were discussing? Who were these MEPs meeting with, and what were the sort of topics that they were discussing?
Yeah, we had 3 committee delegations. That was Foreign Affairs, International Trade, and Security and Defence. So the topics kind of were in that sphere. And the number one topic that our MEPs were bringing up in every meeting was the youth mobility scheme. That's something our Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman, David McAllister especially, was very passionate about it, and saying there should be no reason why to block an exchange of young people, and so that was definitely the one issue. They did meet 4 cabinet ministers in different formations: Nick Thomas-Symonds, Stephen Doughty, Hilary Benn, and Lord Coker, the Minister for Defence, and the International Trade Committee. They were mainly talking about the Windsor Framework. How is Northern Ireland doing currently? The Foreign Affairs Committee, of course, bringing up this future security pact, and as well as the Defence and Security and Defence Committee, they did actually a field trip even outside of London to one of the bases where the UK trains Ukrainian troops, which was extremely interesting for all of the MEPs.
Thank you. So Charlotte has said, do we think there's a scope for organising a model summit for 2025 with EPAS students in the style of a mock UN, a smaller version of Euroscholar, and with a UK-EU angle? So I wonder, maybe like if the next time there are some MEPs coming over, maybe we could sort of mirror that with some UK and EU students and get them discussing some of the issues that matter to them in terms of those relations. I don't know if that's probably not something you can say yes to right now, but is that an interesting idea?
That's absolutely a very interesting idea. I think Typhaine would. I see her nodding there as well. Yes, absolutely. Now that there are clear topics and issues that I think, especially on things like a youth mobility scheme and so on, I think young people could be quite interested in discussing these.
Yeah, and Charlotte's very keen to be involved in organising that. I can very much see Cherwell playing a big part in that. Laura has asked, in terms of freedom of movement, do you envisage any changes, e.g. the reversal of the proposal of e-visas? Brilliant news on the under 30s visa and Erasmus return. Well, I think maybe to just dampen down your enthusiasm, Laura, as far as I understand it, those are issues which are being talked about. They are definitely not things which have been agreed yet. Typhaine, Sanna, what do you know about this reversal of the proposal on e-visas? Is that something which is being discussed?
I'm afraid I think the e-visas, they refer to the ETA and the ETIAS on both sides. These new kind of border requirements, they look like they are coming in any case, because, for example, on the EU side, this ETIAS that is coming is not just for UK, it's for anyone from anywhere entering the EU area, and the UK, the same thing, the ETA, the electronic travel, whatever the A something there.
Authorization, it's also, maybe, who knows?
Exactly, that's it. Sounds good. It is already kind of being phased in for some countries already, and so I'm afraid we'll all have maybe some waiting times on the borders in the future.
Okay, one question, another question that I had, in terms of the negotiations with, well, I guess given that in the Parliament there are more Eurosceptic MEPs than there were previously, MEPs who are maybe less keen on the European Union working more closely together, do you think that will have an impact on how closely they would or the Parliament would want to work with the UK if there are MEPs who are themselves thinking that maybe their country should be working less or on fewer issues together? Do you see what I mean by that question? Has the new makeup, as the more Eurosceptic MEPs in the Parliament made things easier or harder, do you think, in terms of relations with the UK?
Well, I think it's too early to say really yet, but I wouldn't really see that as actually a big issue because, for example, now when we had the 3 committee delegations here last week, there were representatives also from these far-right groups and so on, which are often referred to as the Eurosceptic groups, and at least with this little sample we had, there was no difference in their sort of engagement and even enthusiasm in liaising with the UK counterparts. As they have only just now also started a few months ago, we haven't really seen clear policies in, for example, regarding UK relations, but so far so good. No big changes there.
If I can jump in on this, the 2 things I might want to add. First, there's not such a big surge in number. The big change is also that you have 2 different political groups. There has been an increase, but also because it's more fragmented, again, 200 different national parties. Some of them with very different culture and difficult relationships between them, because that's also the problem with parties on the far right, that, you know, with sometimes xenophobic tendencies or very, very nationalistic tendencies, sometimes they can't be in the same room as other similar parties together. So you also have these two different groups, but again, not a massive increase in the overall number. But also traditionally, these MEPs and these parties favor bilateral relations. So they actually are quite keen on working with the UK as such. They won't oppose working with the UK as such on particular things. They oppose a very federal Europe and too many decisions at European level, but sometimes they can actually be very pro bilateral relations, paradoxically. So we'll see. But as we saw with Sanna, they had very constructive questions and remarks when they were here. So it's too early to say, as you were saying.
That's great to hear. And I think just to expand a little bit on what you were saying about those political groups, where you had the slide with the makeup of the Parliament, and so you showed there that there were 8 political groups, and then talking about 200 political parties. Just in case anybody isn't aware of this, those political groups are a kind of coalition in themselves. So you don't see those political groups when you're voting in your European parliamentary elections. You won't see the name EPP or ECR. You will see your local party, which then goes to the Parliament and forms part of that group, forms that kind of coalition. And so that's when Typhaine is saying about these different political groups, which may not sit so easily together, and that's how those different groups on the right have sort of fractured, or not necessarily fractured because they weren't ever one whole group, but why they have formed in different ways like that. Do we have any other questions? Anybody wanting to raise their hand or add anything to the any question in the chat? So doesn't look like it at the moment, and so I think we just wanted to I think that idea that came from Charlotte about trying to mirror maybe some of these discussions between the UK government and the EU Parliament and European Union structure decision-making bodies, mirror those with groups of young people, I think is a fantastic idea, and we will follow that up at the EPLO UK offices, and we'll see what we can do with that. So in that case, I think we will call the meeting to a close, and thank you all very much for your participation, and thank you, Sanna and Typhaine, for your very useful and insightful comments. And always remember, if there are other questions that you have, if there's other things that you want to know the answers to, we have the research service at the Parliament. We run educational sessions for groups that come to the Parliament to Europe House as well, and we can come to your schools too. So feel free to let us know if there is anything else you would like to know, and we will do our best to answer those questions in a timely fashion. So I will thank you all very much and say goodbye and good evening.
Thank you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.